Zethkalar sat in the darkest corner of the cantina on Epsilon Prime, his forearms wrapped around a glass of fermented Vorthok wine that had gone cold hours ago. The cybernetic replacements where his left arm and right leg used to be clicked softly against the metal table as three young Vorthok cadets approached him with eager faces and bright eyes that had never seen real war. The oldest of the three barely passed his first molting, cleared his throat, and spoke with the confidence that only comes from complete ignorance of reality. Honored veteran, we have heard stories about your service in the human wars, and we would be grateful if you would share your experiences with us, so we might learn from your wisdom. Zethkalar looked up at them with eyes that had seen too much. Death and too many friends turned to ash by human weapons. His scarred face showed no emotion as he studied these young warriors who thought they understood what war meant because they had read reports and watched training videos. He took a long drink from his glass and set it down with deliberate slowness. "You want to hear war stories," he said in a voice that sounded like grinding metal. "You think you know what humans are because your instructors showed you pictures of their soft pink skin and told you they have no natural weapons or thick hides, like proper warriors should have." The three cadets nodded enthusiastically, and the youngest one pulled out a recording device. "We want to learn about their tactics and weaknesses so we can serve the Empire better when we face them in battle." Zethkalar made a sound that might have been laughter if it had not been so bitter. "Weaknesses," he repeated slowly. "Yes, I will tell you about human weaknesses and how those weaknesses nearly destroyed our entire fleet at Kepler Station." The cantina had grown quieter as other patrons noticed the old veteran beginning to speak. Word spread quickly through the station's military district that Zethkalar was finally talking about the human wars after years of silence. Within minutes, beings from dozens of different species had gathered around to listen. Kepler Station was a minor human mining outpost on the edge of their territory. Zethkalar began, his voice carrying across the now silent room. "Intelligence. Reports said it was defended by maybe 200 humans with basic mining equipment and a few outdated weapons. Our fleet commander decided it would be good practice for new officers to take the station with minimal force." He paused to drain his glass completely before continuing. "The human commander was named Jake Sullivan, a former soldier turned mining supervisor who looked like he had spent too many years drinking cheap alcohol and eating processed food. His second in command was an engineer named Lisa Martinez who was so small that two of her could have fit inside one Vorthok armor suit." The cadets leaned forward, expecting to hear about an easy victory that would confirm everything they had learned about human inferiority. Instead, Zethkalar's expression grew darker as he continued, "We surrounded the station with 6 heavy cruisers and demanded their surrender. Sullivan's response was to tell our admiral exactly what anatomically impossible act he could perform on himself. The admiral was so insulted by this crude behavior that he ordered an immediate assault with overwhelming force." Zethkalar's cybernetic arm began to twitch slightly, a nervous habit he had developed since losing the original limb to human weapons. What should have been a 2-hour operation to capture a mining station turned into a 6-month siege that cost us 12,000 warriors and 3 of our best ships. The room was completely silent now except for the soft hum of the station's life support systems. Even the bartender had stopped cleaning glasses to listen to the old warrior's words. "The humans had no heavy weapons and no military shields," Zethkalar continued. "They had mining lasers, construction tools, and whatever personal weapons the miners had brought with them. By every tactical analysis, they should have surrendered after the first bombardment when they realized they could not win." He reached for his empty glass, realized it was empty, and gestured for another drink before continuing. "Instead, they began to do things that no rational military force would ever consider. They used mining charges to collapse sections of their own station, creating choke points where our superior numbers meant nothing. They turned maintenance tunnels into death traps filled with improvised explosives made from mining equipment." The bartender brought him a fresh drink, and Zethkalar took a long sip before continuing his tale. "Martinez, that small human engineer, had somehow rewired their life support systems to create poison gas in certain sections of the station. She could flood areas with toxic fumes at will, forcing our troops to wear full environmental suits. That slowed them down and reduced their effectiveness. One of the cadets shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But surely superior training and equipment eventually won the day, he said, hopeful as if the call fixed him with a stare that made the young warrior wish he had never asked the question. After 3 months of siege, we had lost 4,000 troops, just trying to take the outer sections of a mining station. Our forces controlled maybe half the facility while the humans held the critical areas, including the reactor core and command center. He took another drink and continued. Sullivan had organized the remaining humans into small groups that moved constantly through the maintenance tunnels. They would appear without warning, attack our patrols with improvised weapons, then vanish before we could respond effectively. Every corridor became a potential ambush site in every room. Could be booby-trapped. The old veteran's voice grew quieter but somehow more intense. But the worst part was not the tactical situation. The worst part was what we found when we finally breached their food storage areas after 4 months of siege. The humans had been eating their own dead to survive. A collective gasp went up from the listening crowd, and several beings looked sick at the revelation. Zethkalar nodded grimly at their reaction. They had carefully butchered and preserved the bodies of their fallen comrades, treating them as just another resource to keep fighting. There was no ceremony, no mourning, no proper respect for the dead that any civilized species would show. They had turned their own people into rations because giving up was not something they could consider. He finished his second drink and set the glass down with a sharp click. When we finally took the reactor room in month 6, we found Sullivan and Martinez with 7 other humans making their last stand. They were all wounded, half-starved, and armed with nothing but hand tools and a few improvised bombs. They had held that single room for 18 hours against continuous assault. The cantina was so quiet that the sound of breathing seemed loud in the recycled air. Zethkalar looked around at the faces staring at him with expressions ranging from horror to disbelief. Sullivan died with a mining pick in his hands, still trying to swing it at our warriors even as his life bled out onto the floor. Martinez triggered her last bomb as she died, killing 3 more of our soldiers and damaging equipment we needed to secure the station. They fought like animals backed into a corner, except animals eventually give up when the situation becomes hopeless. He stood up slowly, his cybernetic leg making small mechanical sounds as he moved. You wanted to know about human weaknesses, he said to the 3 cadets who no longer looked eager to hear war stories. Their weakness is that they have no natural weapons, no thick armor, no poison glands or razor claws. They are soft and fragile, and die easily when properly killed. Zethkalar began walking toward the cantina exit, then stopped and looked back at the crowd of listeners. But that weakness made them desperate enough to turn a mining station into a fortress that held against our entire battle fleet for half a year. That weakness made them cunning enough to create weapons from construction tools and food from their own dead. That weakness made them fight harder and longer than any rational warrior would ever consider possible. He paused at the door and spoke his final words to the silent room. We thought we understood war because we had honor and discipline and proper military training. The humans taught us that war is not about honor or proper tactics or civilized behavior. War is about who is willing to do absolutely anything to avoid losing. And humans are willing to do things that would never occur to a sane military mind. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving behind a room full of beings who were beginning to understand that their assumptions about human weakness might be dangerously wrong. 3 days later, Zethkalar found himself back in the same cantina corner, staring at another untouched glass of wine while the 3 young cadets approached him again. This time they were not alone, as word had spread throughout Epsilon Prime about the old veteran's stories, and nearly 24 beings from various species had gathered to hear more about the human wars. The oldest cadet cleared his throat nervously before speaking. Honored Zethkalar, We have discussed your previous story with our instructors, and they suggested we ask you about specific human combat techniques, so we might better understand their methods. Zethkalar looked up at the crowd of eager faces and felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. These young warriors still thought they could learn to fight humans the same way they learned to fight any other enemy species, with proper tactics and rational planning and civilized rules of engagement. Combat techniques, he repeated slowly, testing the words like they were something bitter in his mouth. You want to know about human combat techniques? He took a sip of his wine and set the glass down carefully. Very well, I will tell you about Captain Tony Brooks and what happened during the Battle of Crimson Nebula, and you will learn why human combat techniques cannot be understood by rational minds. The cantina fell silent as beings pressed closer to hear the old warrior's words. Even the background music had been turned off so that nothing would interfere with his story. The Battle of Crimson Nebula was supposed to be our decisive victory against the human fleet. Zethkalar began, his cybernetic arm clicking against the table as he spoke. We had them outnumbered 3-1 with better ships and superior firepower. Our battle computers had calculated a 97% probability of complete victory within 6 hours. He paused to look around at the listening faces, noting how they all showed the same confident expectation that superior numbers and technology would naturally lead to victory. Captain Tony Brooks commanded a human destroyer called the Relentless, one of their smallest warships with a crew of only 200 beings. Intelligence reports showed that Brooks was considered unstable by human military standards and had been disciplined multiple times for disobeying orders. A young Thylakoian officer leaned forward eagerly. So the humans had placed an incompetent commander in charge of one of their ships, she said with obvious satisfaction. This explains why they were defeated so easily. Zethkalar fixed her with a stare that made her wish she had remained silent. The battle began exactly as our computers predicted, he continued. Our superior numbers and firepower quickly disabled or destroyed most of the human fleet. Within 4 hours, only 3 human ships remained functional, and one of those was Brooks' destroyer, which had taken severe damage to its engines and weapon systems. The old veteran's voice grew quieter but somehow more intense as he continued. Any rational commander would have attempted to retreat or surrender when faced with such overwhelming odds. Brooks instead ordered his crew to ram the Relentless directly into our flagship, the dreadnought Eternal Conquest. Several beings in the crowd made sounds of disbelief, as ramming attacks were considered primitive and ineffective against modern warship shields and armor. Zethkalar nodded at their reaction. Our shields absorbed most of the impact and our armor prevented serious structural damage, he said. The human destroyer was completely destroyed and most of its crew died instantly from the collision. By all tactical analysis, Brooks' final action had been a meaningless gesture that accomplished nothing except the pointless death of his people. He took another sip of wine before continuing, and his hand trembled slightly as he raised the glass. What we did not understand was that the ramming attack was not meant to destroy our ship. It was meant to get human soldiers inside our shields where they could board the Eternal Conquest. The crowd stirred uneasily as they began to understand that this story was not going to end with a simple human defeat. Zethkalar's scarred face showed no emotion as he continued. 43 human crew members survived the collision, all of them wounded and all of them dying from radiation exposure and decompression injuries. They had maybe 6 hours to live, under the best medical care, and they were trapped inside a hostile warship surrounded by 3,000 Vorthic warriors. He set his glass down and looked directly at the 3 cadets who had started this conversation. Any rational beings would have surrendered immediately and requested medical assistance. Instead, they began fighting their way through our ship using makeshift weapons and improvised explosives, turning our own corridors into a nightmare. The cantina was completely silent now as Zethkalar's words painted a picture that challenged everything the listeners thought they knew about combat behavior. The leader of these dying humans was a sergeant named Kelly Adams, a female warrior who had sustained a collapsed lung and broken spine during the collision. She should have been unconscious or dead from her injuries his cybernetic leg made. Small mechanical sounds as he shifted position, a reminder of his own encounters with human determination. Instead, Adams organized her dying crew into small combat groups that moved through our ship like ghosts, appearing without warning to attack our patrols. Before vanishing into maintenance shafts and service tunnels we never thought to guard. One of the cadets spoke up hesitantly. But surely your superior numbers and knowledge of your own ship layout gave you the advantage in hunting down these intruders. Zethkalar made that bitter sound that might have been laughter. We thought so too, he said. We organized hunting parties with full military equipment and detailed maps of every corridor and room in the ship. What we did not account for was that dying humans fight differently than healthy ones. He paused to order another drink, using the time to gather his thoughts before continuing the tale. Adams and her people had maybe 4 hours left to live from radiation poisoning, so they fought with complete desperation because they had nothing left to lose. They set up ambush in places where no rational warrior would position themselves, like sealed compartments filled with toxic gas or unstable areas where explosions could collapse entire sections. The bartender brought his fresh drink and Zethkalar took a long sip before continuing. They used their own dying bodies as weapons, allowing themselves to be mortally wounded in order to get close enough to our warriors to detonate, improvise bombs, or use captured weapons at point-blank range. His voice grew even quieter as he described events that still haunted his dreams decades later. Adams herself fought for 12 hours with injuries that should have killed her in the first 20 minutes. She used a broken piece of metal from her own ship as a weapon, killing Vorthok warriors who were bigger, stronger, and better armed than she could ever be. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word as the old veteran described a type of warfare that made no rational sense. Our hunting parties found human bodies in impossible locations, like sealed air vents, and spaces too small for a normal being to fit through. They had crawled into these places while dying just to set up one more ambush or plant one more explosive device. Zethkalar's cybernetic arm began to twitch more noticeably as he continued. The worst part was not just that they were fighting while dying from radiation and injuries. The worst part was that they seemed to get more dangerous as they got closer to death. Like pain and hopelessness made them stronger instead of weaker. He took another drink and looked around at the faces, staring at him with expressions ranging from fascination to horror. After 8 hours of hunting these dying humans through our own ship, we had lost over 400 warriors to 43 radiation-poisoned enemies who should have been unconscious or dead. The old veteran's voice became almost a whisper as he reached the climax of his story. When we finally cornered Adams in the reactor room, she was barely conscious and had lost so much blood that her uniform was completely soaked. She could no longer stand upright and was using a wall to support her weight. He paused for a long moment, staring into his wine glass as if he could see the past reflected in the dark liquid. Our squad leader offered her medical assistance and an honorable surrender, following proper military protocol for defeated enemies. Adams responded by detonating the last of her improvised explosives, killing herself and 6 more of our warriors. Zethkalar finished his drink and set the empty glass down with deliberate slowness. By the time we eliminated all 43 human survivors, they had killed over 600 of our people and damaged critical systems throughout the ship. They fought for 15 hours while dying from radiation poisoning. Using nothing but improvised weapons and pure determination, he stood up slowly, his mechanical leg making soft clicking sounds as he moved. "You asked about human combat techniques," he said to the silent crowd. "Here is what you need to understand about fighting humans. They do not get weaker when they are losing. They get more desperate. They do not surrender when the situation becomes hopeless. They use hopelessness as a weapon." A week had passed since Zethkalar's last story, but the cantina on Epsilon Prime remained crowded with beings from across the galaxy who wanted to hear more about the human wars. The old Vorthok veteran had become something of a legend on the station, though he seemed to take no pleasure in his newfound fame as he sat in his usual corner, nursing another untouched glass of the same 3 cadets approached him again. But this time they were accompanied by a senior officer whose uniform bore the insignia of the Galactic Military Academy. The officer, a tall reptilian being with ceremonial scars covering his neck, spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Veteran Zethkalar. "I am Commander Vorthak of the Academy Strategic Studies Department," he said formally. "My students have reported your accounts of human warfare tactics, and I must ask why the Vorthak Empire did not simply use orbital bombardment to eliminate human colonies and avoid these costly ground engagements." Zethkalar looked up at the commander with eyes that had seen too many confident officers learn painful lessons about human determination. He gestured for the group to sit down, noting how the cantina had fallen silent as other patrons recognized that another story was about to begin. "Orbital bombardment," Zethkalar repeated slowly, testing the words like they were something that left a bad taste in his mouth. "Yes, Commander, we tried that approach as well. I will tell you about New Texas and why our attempt to glass that human colony from orbit became the longest and most expensive military campaign in Vorthak history." The old veteran took a sip of his wine and set the glass down carefully before continuing. New Texas was a farming world on the outer edge of human space with maybe 2 million colonists, most of them families who had never served in their military. Intelligence reports showed no significant military installations and no planetary defense systems that could threaten our fleet. Commander Vorthak leaned forward with interest. "A perfect target for demonstrating Vorthak's superiority through overwhelming firepower," he said approvingly. "Surely the complete destruction of an entire human world would convince their government to surrender." Zethkalar made that bitter sound that might have been laughter. "That was exactly what our fleet commander thought when he ordered the orbital bombardment of New Texas. We used plasma bombs and fusion weapons to destroy every major city and military installation on the planet, killing over half the human population in the first 6 hours." He paused to look around at the listening faces, noting how they all showed the same satisfaction that proper military tactics had finally been applied to the human problem. "The bombardment was so thorough that our sensors showed no significant life signs or technological activity remaining on the planet's surface. By all military analysis, New Texas had been successfully eliminated as a threat." The commander nodded approvingly. "Exactly as orbital bombardment should work against primitive colonies lacking adequate defenses. We left a garrison of 50,000 warriors on the planet to secure valuable mining sites and establish a forward base for future operations," Zethkalar continued, his voice growing darker. "What we did not realize was that approximately 800,000 humans had survived the bombardment by hiding in underground shelters, natural caves, and buried facilities." The cantina was completely silent now as beings pressed closer to hear the old warrior's words. Even the background music had been turned off so that nothing would interfere with his story. The human survivors were led by a former Marine named Sam Foster and a civilian leader named Grace Turner, who had organized the evacuation into underground shelters before our attack began. They had somehow predicted that orbital bombardment was coming and prepared their people for a long siege. Zethkalar's cybernetic arm began to click against the table as he spoke, a nervous habit that indicated he was approaching the most disturbing parts of his story. What we thought would be a simple occupation of a destroyed world turned into a 30-year guerrilla war that consumed 3 entire Vorthak battle fleets and cost us over 2 million warriors. Commander Vorthak shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "But surely superior technology and orbital support gave your forces an overwhelming advantage against primitive human survivors." The old veteran fixed him with a stare that made the commander wish he had never asked the question. "The humans had no advanced technology and no way to replace their losses through normal supply lines," he said. "What they had was something far more dangerous. They had turned their entire surviving population into a military force dedicated to killing Vorthak soldiers." He took another sip of wine before continuing. "Foster and Turner had organized the survivors into small groups that lived completely underground, coming to the surface only to attack our patrols and supply convoys. They had turned their children into soldiers, their elderly into saboteurs, and their farmers into weapons manufacturers. The crowd stirred uneasily as they began to understand that this story was going to challenge their assumptions about civilized warfare. Zethkalar nodded at their reaction. Every human on New Texas became a potential enemy combatant, regardless of age or gender or previous occupation. They taught their children to set explosive traps and poison water supplies. They trained their elderly to gather intelligence and coordinate attacks through hidden communication networks. His voice grew quieter, but somehow more intense as he continued. The worst part was not their military tactics, but their psychological warfare. They would leave the bodies of our dead warriors arranged in specific patterns as messages to our command staff. They carved symbols into the armor of killed soldiers. To mark territory or warn about upcoming attacks, one of the cadets spoke up hesitantly. But surely your superior numbers and equipment eventually wore down their resistance. Zethkalar's scarred face showed no emotion as he responded. After 10 years of occupation, we had lost 15,000 warriors to an enemy that should have been completely destroyed. Our garrison commander requested reinforcements and was sent another 20,000 soldiers with orders to eliminate all remaining human survivors. He paused to order another drink, using the time to gather his thoughts before continuing the tale. What our commanders did not understand was that every Vorthik death on New Texas created more human resistance fighters instead of fewer. The survivors treated each of our dead as proof that they could win if they just kept fighting long enough. The bartender brought his fresh drink, and Zethkalar took a long sip before continuing. Foster had organized a system where human children were taught the names and faces of every Vorthik soldier killed on their world. They created monuments and ceremonies honoring their own dead while celebrating ours as victories in their war of liberation. His voice became almost a whisper as he described events that still haunted the dreams of Vorthak veterans. Decades later, the humans began using our own dead as psychological weapons, displaying Vorthak bodies in public places to prove that we could be killed and to encourage more colonists to join their resistance movement. The old veteran's cybernetic leg made small mechanical sounds as he shifted position. After 20 years of fighting, our original garrison of 50,000 had been reduced to less than 5,000 effective soldiers. The humans had somehow turned a destroyed world into a military training ground that produced new fighters. Faster than we could eliminate them, he took another drink and looked around at the faces staring at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to horror. Grace Turner had created schools in underground bunkers where human children learned reading and mathematics, alongside weapon maintenance and explosive techniques. They turned education into military training and childhood into preparation for warfare. The cantina was so quiet that the sound of breathing seemed loud in the recycled air. Zethkalar's words painted a picture of warfare that made no rational sense to civilized minds. The most disturbing aspect of the New Texas campaign was how the humans seemed to get stronger through suffering instead of weaker. Every family that lost members to our forces produced more dedicated resistance fighters. Every destroyed settlement became a rallying point for increased attacks against our positions. He finished his drink and set the empty glass down with deliberate slowness. After 30 years of occupation, we had deployed over 150,000 warriors to New Texas and lost more than 60% of them to an enemy that had started as primitive farmers with improvised weapons. Commander Vorthak spoke up with obvious confusion. But how did your forces eventually achieve victory against such determined resistance? Zethkalar stood up slowly, his mechanical leg making soft clicking sounds as he moved. We did not achieve victory, he said quietly. After 30 years and 2 million casualties, the Vorthik Empire abandoned New Texas and classified the entire world as a quarantine zone too dangerous for occupation. The old veteran walked toward the cantina exit, then stopped and looked back at the silent crowd. When our final evacuation ships left New Texas, there were still over 300,000 human survivors hiding in underground cities. They had built from the ruins of our equipment and the bones of our dead. The cantina on Epsilon Prime had become an unofficial gathering place for military officers from across the galaxy who wanted to hear HFY stories about human warfare. Tonight the crowd was larger than ever, including several high-ranking commanders from different species who had traveled specifically to hear the old Vorthik veteran speak about tactics that defied conventional military wisdom. HFY sat in his usual corner, staring at his reflection in an untouched glass of wine while conversations buzzed around him in a dozen different languages. The weight of memory pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden as he contemplated which story to tell next to these eager young warriors, who still thought war could be understood through proper analysis and rational planning. A familiar voice interrupted his brooding as Commander Vorthak approached with several other officers in tow. Veteran HFY, I have brought colleagues from the Strategic Planning Institute who are particularly interested in your accounts of human technological adaptations during the war. HFY looked up at the group of confident faces and recognized the same expression he had once worn himself, the certainty that superior technology and logical tactics would always defeat inferior equipment and emotional decision-making. He gestured for them to sit down, noting how the cantina fell silent as word spread that another story was about to begin. Technological adaptations, he repeated slowly, testing the words like they were something dangerous. Yes, I will tell you about Dr. Paul Anderson and Karen White, and how they created weapons that turned our own logical combat systems against us during what became known as the Prometheus Gambit. The old veteran took a sip of his wine and set the glass down carefully before continuing. By the fourth year of the war, our military computers had analyzed every human ship design and combat tactic, creating perfect countermeasures for their predictable behavioral patterns. We could defeat any human fleet because our systems could calculate their next move before they made it. One of the Institute officers leaned forward with interest. Exactly as proper military technology should function against primitive enemies, who rely on emotion instead of logic. HFY made that bitter sound that might have been laughter. That was exactly what our fleet commanders believed when they encountered the first Prometheus-class ships at the Battle of Titan's Gate. These new human vessels appeared to be standard destroyers with conventional weapons and normal, tactical capabilities. He paused to look around at the listening faces, noting how they all showed the same confidence that advanced technology would naturally overcome human desperation. Dr. Paul Anderson was a human scientist who specialized in artificial intelligence and psychological warfare, while Karen White was a test pilot who had somehow survived 17 different experimental ship crashes without permanent injury. The cantina was completely silent now as beings pressed closer to hear the old warrior's words. Even servers had stopped moving to avoid making noise that might interfere with his story. Anderson and White had created ships with combat systems that did not follow logical programming, HFY continued, his cybernetic arm beginning to click against the table. Instead of using mathematical calculations to determine the best tactical response, their ships fought using randomized behavioral patterns based on human psychological profiles. Commander Vorthak looked confused by this revelation, but surely random tactics would be inferior to calculated strategies based on optimal efficiency and proven combat doctrine. The old veteran fixed him with a stare that made the commander wish he had remained silent. That was what our combat computers assumed when they first engaged Prometheus-class ships in battle, he said. Our systems analyzed the human vessels, calculated their most likely responses, and prepared perfect countermeasures for logical tactical decisions. His voice grew darker as he continued. What happened instead was that the human ships began fighting like dozens of different enemies all at once, switching between behavioral patterns so quickly that our computers could not adapt fast enough to counter their tactics. HFY took another sip of wine before describing the most disturbing aspects of his story. One moment, a Prometheus ship would fight like a coward, running from our forces and leading them into ambush positions. The next moment, the same ship would attack like a berserker, charging directly into our formations with complete disregard for tactical logic. The crowd stirred uneasily as they began to understand that this story was going to challenge their faith in technological superiority. The old veteran nodded at their reaction. Our combat computers were designed to predict Enemy behavior based on rational decision-making and consistent tactical doctrines, he continued. The Prometheus ships fought using patterns that changed randomly between cowardice, madness, genius, and pure desperation, sometimes switching tactics in the middle of individual engagements. His cybernetic leg made small mechanical sounds as he shifted position. Anderson had somehow programmed artificial intelligence systems to fight, using human emotional responses instead of logical calculations. Their ships would make brilliant tactical decisions followed immediately by seemingly suicidal attacks that somehow succeeded despite being completely irrational. One of the Institute officers spoke up with obvious confusion. But how can random tactics be effective against properly calculated military responses based on proven combat theory? Zethkalar's scarred face showed no emotion as he responded. Because our combat systems were designed to fight rational enemies. Who would make logical decisions based on available information and tactical advantage? The Prometheus ships fought like individual humans with different personalities, fears, and psychological disorders. He paused to order another drink, using the time to gather his thoughts before continuing the tale. Karen White had created pilot training programs that taught human commanders to fight using psychological profiles of famous warriors, criminals, cowards, and madmen from their history. Each ship could switch between fighting like different human personalities at random intervals. The bartender brought his fresh drink and Zethkalar took a long sip before continuing. Our fleet would engage what appeared to be a careful, tactical commander making logical decisions, only to have the same ship suddenly start fighting like an insane berserker, who had no concern for survival or tactical advantage. His voice became almost a whisper as he described events that still challenged his understanding of warfare decades later. The worst part was not just that we could not predict their tactics, but that their irrational behavior somehow produced effective results that made no mathematical sense. The old veteran's cybernetic arm began to twitch more noticeably as he continued. A Prometheus ship would retreat from a battle it was winning, leading our forces into what appeared to be a trap, only to have the retreat turn into a successful escape that saved the human vessel from destruction we had not yet planned. He took another drink and looked around at the faces staring at him with expressions ranging from fascination to disbelief. Other ships would attack superior forces with tactics so reckless that our computers could not calculate any possible scenario where such behavior could succeed. Yet somehow these suicidal attacks would inflict massive damage before the human ships were destroyed. The cantina was so quiet that the sound of breathing seemed loud in the recycled air. Zethkalar's words painted a picture of warfare that violated every principle of military science that civilized species understood. Anderson had created artificial intelligence that could think like humans with mental disorders, emotional instability, and psychological trauma, he continued. 2 weeks had passed since Zethkalar's last story about the Prometheus Gambit, but the cantina on Epsilon Prime remained crowded with beings who had traveled from across the galaxy to hear the old Vorthak veterans' accounts of human warfare. Military academies were now sending their best students to listen, and several governments had dispatched intelligence officers to record his stories for analysis by their strategic planning department. Zethalek sat in his usual corner, surrounded by empty glasses that marked the passage of time and the weight of memories he carried. Tonight the crowd included representatives from 12 different species, all of them eager to understand how humans had managed to fight effectively against superior military forces. A young cadet from the Centaurian Defense Corps approached hesitantly, her ceremonial uniform marking her as one of the elite students from their most prestigious military academy. Honored veteran, our instructors have told us that human military forces must have exceptional individual warriors to compensate for their technological disadvantages. Could you tell us about their greatest combat specialists? Zethkalar looked up at her with eyes that had seen too many assumptions about human warfare proven wrong in the most painful ways possible. He gestured for the crowd to sit down, noting how the cantina fell silent as word spread that another story was about to begin. Greatest combat specialists, he repeated slowly, testing the words like they were something bitter. Yes, I will tell you about the defense of Titan Base and the warriors we encountered there, and you will learn why human military effectiveness cannot be measured by traditional standards. The old veteran reached for a fresh glass of wine and took a careful sip before continuing. Titan Base was a critical fuel depot and repair facility that supplied the entire human fleet in the Outer Rim sector. Intelligence reports showed it was defended by an elite regiment of their most experienced soldiers with advanced weapons and fortified positions. The young cadet leaned forward with interest, expecting to hear about legendary human warriors whose skills and equipment had made them formidable opponents. Instead, Zethkalar's expression grew darker as he continued. Our assault force included 20,000 of our best warriors supported by orbital bombardment and heavy armor units. Military analysis indicated we would overwhelm the human defenders within 6 hours and capture the base with minimal casualties. He paused to look around at the listening faces, noting how they all showed the same confidence that superior numbers and proper military training would naturally lead to victory. What we found when we breached the outer defenses was not what our intelligence reports had prepared us to expect. The cantina was completely silent now as beings pressed closer to hear the old warrior's words. Even the background music had been turned off so that nothing would interfere with his story. The elite human regiment had been evacuated 3 days before our attack, leaving behind only support personnel who were supposed to destroy the facility and retreat before we arrived. Zethkalar continued, his cybernetic arm beginning to click against the table. What remained were cooks, mechanics, medical staff, and maintenance workers who had never been trained for combat operations. Commander Vorthak, who had become a regular listener to these stories, looked confused by this revelation. Surely, support personnel would surrender immediately when faced with overwhelming military force. Zethkalar made that bitter sound that might have been laughter. That was what our assault commander expected when he demanded their surrender over the base communication system. The response came from a cook named Danny Murphy, who told our commander exactly what anatomically impossible act he could perform. On himself, the crowd stirred uneasily as they began to understand that this story was going to challenge their assumptions about human military organization. The old veteran nodded at their reaction. Murphy had somehow organized the remaining support staff into defensive positions using kitchen equipment, maintenance tools, and medical supplies as weapons, he continued. They had turned the base's cafeteria into a fortress and the repair bays into killing zones filled with improvised explosives. His voice grew quieter but somehow more intense as he continued. The first wave of our assault troops encountered resistance that made no tactical sense according to any military doctrine we had studied. The humans were using welding torches as flame weapons and kitchen knives as projectiles launched from improvised crossbows. One of the cadets spoke up hesitantly. But surely professional soldiers with proper equipment could easily overcome maintenance workers with improvised weapons. Zethkalar's scarred face showed no emotion as he responded. Amy Johnson was a mechanic who specialized in repairing food preparation equipment and had never fired a weapon in combat, he said. She held the main reactor room for 6 hours using nothing but a wrench and explosive charges made from cleaning chemicals. He took another sip of wine before continuing. The problem was not that these humans were skilled warriors, but that they fought with the desperation of beings who had decided that dying was preferable to surrendering, and they knew their workplace better than any attacking force could. The old veteran's cybernetic leg made small mechanical sounds as he shifted position. Johnson had rigged every maintenance tunnel and service shaft with traps made from kitchen equipment and medical supplies. She turned the reactor room into a maze of death where our superior numbers meant nothing because only one warrior at a time could advance. His voice became almost a whisper as he described events that still haunted his dreams decades later. The most disturbing aspect was not their improvised weapons or knowledge of the facility layout, but their complete refusal to accept that they could not win against overwhelming odds. The cantina was so quiet that the sound of breathing seemed loud in the recycled air. Zethkalar's words painted a picture of warfare that made no rational sense to military minds, trained in proper tactical thinking. Murphy organized cooking staff into combat units that used their knowledge of food preparation to create chemical weapons from cleaning supplies and kitchen chemicals, he continued. They turned the base's medical bay into a torture chamber, where wounded Vorthic soldiers were treated with procedures that caused more pain than healing. Zethkalar's cybernetic arm began to twitch more noticeably as he approached the most disturbing parts of his story. After 12 hours of fighting, we had lost over 3,000 warriors to maybe 60 human support personnel, who should have surrendered or fled when faced with professional military assault. He took another drink and looked around at the faces staring at him with expressions ranging from disbelief to horror. The worst moment came when we finally breached the reactor room and found Johnson with 5 other humans making their final stand using nothing but hand tools and determination. The old veteran finished his drink and set the empty glass down with deliberate slowness. Johnson was wounded in 7 places and had lost so much blood that she could barely stand, but she was still trying to activate the base's self-destruct system when our warriors killed. Her commander Vorthak spoke up with obvious confusion. But how could untrained support personnel inflict such casualties on professional military forces? Zethkalar stood up slowly, his mechanical leg making soft clicking sounds as he moved. Because every human at Titan Base fought like their life and the lives of everyone they cared about depended on holding that single room for just one more minute, he said quietly. They had no military training, no proper weapons, and no chance of survival, but they had something more dangerous than any of those advantages. He walked toward the cantina exit, then stopped and looked back at the silent crowd of military professionals who were beginning to understand that human warfare could not be analyzed using conventional methods. They had the absolute conviction that surrender was not an option, and that dying while fighting was preferable to living under enemy occupation, he said to the stunned room. Murphy and Johnson and their people were not elite warriors or combat specialists. They were ordinary humans who decided that being ordinary was not acceptable when their world was threatened. The old veteran paused at the door and spoke his final words to the gathering of beings who represented the military elite of dozens of different species. You study individual combat effectiveness as if it can be measured by training, equipment, and tactical knowledge, he said quietly. Humans taught us that the most dangerous warriors are not those who are trained to fight, but those who choose to fight regardless of training, equipment, or odds of survival. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving behind a room full of military professionals who were beginning to understand that human society itself was a military force, where every individual could become a deadly enemy when properly motivated by desperation and determination. A month had passed since Zethkalar began sharing his stories about the human wars, and the cantina on Epsilon Prime had been permanently transformed into an unofficial conference center where military leaders from across the galaxy gathered to hear the old Vorthic veteran speak. Tonight the crowd was the largest yet, including admirals, generals, and strategic planners who had traveled from the farthest reaches of known space to understand how humans had managed to fight effectively against technologically superior Zethkalar. Sut in his usual corner, surrounded by the accumulated weight of memories that had defined his life for decades. His cybernetic replacements clicked softly against the table as he contemplated the final story he would tell to these eager listeners who still believed that warfare could be understood through proper analysis and rational planning. Grand Admiral Vekvar of the Galactic Defense Consortium approached with a delegation of the highest-ranking military officers from 12 different species. His formal uniform and ceremonial decorations marked him as one of the most powerful beings in the known galaxy, yet he spoke with the respect due to someone whose experiences had shaped military thinking across countless worlds. Honored Zethkalar, we have studied your accounts of human warfare tactics and find them both fascinating and disturbing, he said formally. However, we must ask about the ultimate resolution of the conflict. Surely the Vorthic Empire eventually achieved victory through superior resources and proper military strategy. Zethkalar looked up at the Grand Admiral with eyes that had witnessed the end of everything he had once believed about warfare and military superiority. He gestured for the massive crowd to gather closer, knowing that this would be his final story and the most important lesson he could share with these confident warriors. Ultimate resolution, he repeated slowly, testing the words like they were. Something dangerous that might explode if handled carelessly. Yes, Grand Admiral. I will tell you about the treaty negotiations and what I learned about human nature during those final days of the war. The old veteran reached for what would be his last glass of wine in this cantina and took a careful sip before continuing. After 7 years of fighting, both sides had suffered losses that made continued warfare economically and politically unsustainable. Our government agreed to negotiate a peace treaty that would end hostilities while preserving the honor and territorial integrity of both species. The cantina was completely silent now as hundreds of beings pressed closer to hear the conclusion of stories that had challenged everything they thought they knew about human warfare. Even servers had stopped working to listen to the old warrior's final words. I was selected to attend the treaty negotiations as a military advisor because of my extensive combat experience against human forces, Zethkalar continued, his cybernetic arm beginning to click against the table with increasing frequency. Our delegation expected to negotiate with defeated enemies who would accept reasonable terms in exchange for an end to their suffering. Grand Admiral Vekvar leaned forward with interest. Exactly as proper diplomatic protocol should function. When superior forces offer reasonable peace terms to exhausted opponents, Zethkalar made that bitter sound that might have been laughter for the final time. The human delegation was led by Admiral Steve Collins and diplomat Rachel Stone, both of whom had lost family members during the war and had every reason to hate Vorthek forces with personal intensity. He paused to look around at the listening faces, noting how they all showed the same expectation that defeated enemies would naturally seek peace through reasonable compromise. What we encountered instead were human negotiators who approached the peace talks with the same calm professionalism they had shown during the worst battles of the war. The old veteran's voice grew darker as he continued. Collins and Stone discussed territorial boundaries, reparation payments, and prisoner exchanges with the detached efficiency of beings who were conducting routine business, rather than ending a devastating conflict that had cost millions of lives. His cybernetic leg made small mechanical sounds as he shifted position, a reminder of his own encounters with human determination. The most disturbing aspect of the negotiations was not their demands or territorial concessions, but their complete lack of satisfaction with victory or relief at the prospect of peace. One of the admirals spoke up with obvious confusion. But surely beings who had fought so desperately for survival would show some emotion. When achieving their goals through successful resistance, Zethkalar's scarred face showed no emotion as he responded to a question that revealed how little these military leaders understood about human psychology. Admiral Collins signed the peace treaty with the same expression he might have used to approve routine supply requisitions, he said quietly. There was no celebration, no satisfaction, no sense that a great victory had been achieved. He took another sip of wine before continuing with the most disturbing revelation of his entire military career. During a break in the negotiations, I approached Diplomat Stone privately to express my personal respect for human courage during the war and my hope that our species could build lasting friendship through mutual understanding. The cantina was so quiet that the sound of breathing seemed loud in the recycled air as hundreds of beings waited to hear the conclusion of stories that had already changed their understanding of warfare itself. Stone looked at me with eyes that showed no hatred or anger or satisfaction, Zethkalar continued, his voice becoming almost a whisper. She thanked me politely for my courtesy and then said something that has haunted my dreams for 30 years since that conversation. The old veteran finished his wine and set the empty glass down with deliberate slowness, knowing that his next words would disturb the sleep of everyone listening for years to come. She said that humans did not consider the war to be over, merely paused until circumstances required them to fight again. A collective gasp went up from the listening crowd, as they began to understand that human peace might not mean the same thing as peace for other species. Zethkalar nodded grimly at their reaction. Stone explained that humans view warfare as a continuous process that SOMETIM includes periods of active fighting and sometimes includes periods of preparation for future fighting. He continued, they had signed the peace treaty not because they were satisfied with victory, but because temporary peace would allow them to become stronger for whatever conflicts lay ahead. Grand Admiral Lekvar spoke up with obvious alarm. But surely rational beings understand that peace treaties are meant to establish permanent resolution of territorial and political disputes. Zethkalar fixed him with a stare that made the Grand Admiral understand he was about to learn something that would change how he thought about human relations for the rest of his life. Admiral Collins told our delegation that humans had used the 7 years of war to study Vorthic technology, tactics, and psychology so thoroughly that they now understood us better than we understood ourselves. His voice grew even quieter as he revealed the most chilling aspect of human strategic thinking. He said that if fighting resumed in the future, humans would be prepared to defeat Vorthak forces more quickly and efficiently because they had learned from every battle, every defeat, and every victory during our conflict. The old veteran stood up slowly, his mechanical leg making soft clicking sounds as he prepared to leave the cantina for the final time. The peace treaty was signed with calm efficiency by human representatives, who showed no satisfaction in ending the war because they had never stopped preparing for the next one. He walked toward the cantina exit while hundreds of beings sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of what they had just learned about human nature and strategic thinking. You have asked me to share stories about human warfare so you might understand their tactics and capabilities, he said, to the silent room without turning around. Here is the most important lesson I can give you. The war with humans never really ended. It just moved from active combat to active preparation for future combat. Zethkalar paused at the door and spoke his final words to the gathering of military leaders who represented the strategic planning capabilities of dozens of different species. Somewhere in human space right now, their military forces are studying recordings of these conversations and analyzing your reactions to develop new tactics for fighting your species more effectively. The old veteran's cybernetic arm clicked one final time against the doorframe as he prepared to leave. They are not preparing to fight the same war again. They are preparing to fight better wars against enemies who still think peace means the end of military planning rather than the beginning of more sophisticated military planning. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, leaving behind a room full of the galaxy's most experienced military leaders who were beginning to understand that their assumptions about human peace might be dangerously naive and that every moment of quiet might be purchased with the promise of future violence more terrible than anything they had yet imagined.